Power. Some abuse it. Others fight for it. Marcus Carter had spent his life proving himself a brilliant businessman, a devoted family man, and a self-made success. But to men like Richard Wallace, none of that mattered. As CEO of SkyJet Airlines, Richard believed power was his to control. When Marcus, his wife Elaine, and their daughter Ava walked into the first-class lounge, they weren't treated with respect. Instead, they were met with delays, excuses, and humiliation. Richard didn't just want them off his airline. He wanted to remind them of their place. What he didn't know was that Marcus Carter was the last man he should have crossed. What started as an act of discrimination would soon become a downfall broadcast for the world to see. Richard had spent his life making others feel powerless. Today, he would finally understand what it meant to lose everything. If you believe in justice, hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Is Richard about to get what he deserves? Stay tuned. This revenge is just getting started. Richard Wallace had spent years cultivating an image of authority, power, and control. As the CEO of SkyJet Airlines, he was known for making ruthless business decisions, but his real satisfaction came from something much more personal: reminding people of their place. It was never direct. A smirk here, a delay there, a single call that could make a problem appear out of thin air. He didn't have to yell, threaten, or even explain himself. Power wasn't about loud displays. It was about making someone's life difficult in ways they couldn't even trace back to you. He sat comfortably in the SkyJet first-class lounge, swirling a glass of imported scotch, scanning the room with the casual indifference of a king surveying his court. Business executives in neatly pressed suits scrolled through their emails. A few socialites whispered among themselves, their designer bags tucked neatly beside them. Everything was in order until they walked in. A black family. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as he observed them. There was nothing out of place about them. If anything, they fit the part too well. Marcus Carter, a man in his mid-40s, carried himself with the calm authority of someone who was used to being respected. His navy blue blazer was perfectly tailored, his watch understated but undeniably expensive. His wife, Elaine, matched his confidence, her cream-colored dress effortlessly elegant. Their daughter, Ava, was a typical teenager, her fingers lightly tapping on her phone as she followed her parents toward the seating area. But it wasn't their appearance that bothered Richard. It was the way they acted. They didn't hesitate. They didn't look around as if questioning whether they were in the right place. They walked in as if they belonged. And that was a problem. Richard had spent years ensuring that SkyJet's first-class experience remained exclusive, not just in terms of money, but in the unspoken rules of status. There were people who had wealth, and there were people who understood wealth. The Carters had the former, but Richard was determined to remind them that they would never truly possess the latter. He set down his drink and pulled out his phone. With a few quick taps, he sent a message to his security chief. Family at Lounge Gate 3. Check their credentials. Full scrutiny. The response came within seconds. Understood. Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving them. The first step was always subtle. Make them feel watched. Make them feel uneasy. He smirked slightly as he saw it working. Marcus glanced up, his sharp gaze flicking toward the edges of the room. He had noticed the sudden shift. Security personnel, previously stationed near the lounge entrance, had repositioned themselves, lingering just close enough to be noticeable. They weren't acting yet. They didn't need to. Richard enjoyed this part the most, the waiting. He had seen it time and time again. Some people caught on quickly, their smiles faltering, their posture shifting as discomfort crept in. Others didn't notice at first, too preoccupied with their own conversations. But eventually they always felt it, that slow, creeping realization that something was wrong. Elaine leaned in slightly, murmuring something to Marcus. He nodded subtly, but kept his expression neutral. Ava, still engrossed in her phone, remained unaware. Richard smirked. The best players never made their move too soon. This was a game of patience precision. He could have walked over right then, flashed his CEO badge, and demanded to know what they were doing here. But that wasn't how he operated. He preferred to let people feel the weight of their exclusion before he crushed them completely. His phone buzzed. Another message. On standby. Do you want us to intervene? Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he typed back. Not yet. Let them settle first. Another test of patience. Another moment for them to believe, even for just a few minutes, that nothing was wrong. He watched as Marcus reached into his leather travel bag and pulled out a tablet, scrolling through emails. Elaine adjusted her bracelet, her gaze moving toward one of the attendants bringing out fresh coffee. Ava put her phone down just long enough to stretch, then resumed whatever she was doing. They were comfortable. Richard almost laughed. With practiced ease, he stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit as he walked toward the front desk. A young employee, Kathy, immediately straightened as he approached. "Sir," she greeted, professional but slightly nervous. "Kathy," he said smoothly, "I need a full verification on that family over there." She blinked. "Sir, they're on the manifest. They've already been cleared for first class." Richard's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped just enough to send a chill down her spine. "I don't recall asking for a status update," he said, voice calm but cutting. "I gave you an instruction. If they have nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem, should it?" Kathy swallowed hard. "No, sir. Of course not." "Good." He gave her a tight smile before glancing back at his targets. "Let's see how patient they really are." He turned away, not bothering to watch as Kathy hesitated, then reached for her tablet, preparing to carry out his orders. He already knew how it would play out. By the time this was over, they wouldn't just be leaving the lounge. They'd be leaving the airport altogether. And Richard Wallace would make sure they never forgot their place again. Marcus Carter stretched his legs slightly as he leaned back into the plush seat of the SkyJet first-class lounge. He glanced at his watch, noting they still had a comfortable 30 minutes before boarding. Elaine sat beside him, flipping through an online magazine on her tablet, while Ava scrolled through her phone, nodding along to whatever music was playing in her earbuds. Everything was smooth, exactly as a first-class experience should be. The soft hum of conversation filled the lounge, blending with the occasional clinking of glasses and the low murmur of a flight announcement over the intercom. The environment was relaxing, until a sharply dressed airline staff member entered their line of sight and made a direct path toward them. He was in his late 40s, tall, and carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of polite authority. His name tag read David Thompson, SkyJet Operations, and the moment his gaze locked onto Marcus, a professional yet slightly strained smile formed on his lips. "Mr. Carter?" His voice was crisp, rehearsed. Marcus looked up, offering a polite nod. "That's me. I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your reservation." Elaine paused mid-scroll. Ava, still engrossed in her phone, didn't react. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. "An issue?" David nodded sympathetically, as if he understood the mild annoyance this must be causing. "Yes, unfortunately. Our system flagged a discrepancy with your booking. It appears that first class is at full capacity, and we will need to move your reservation to a later flight. Of course, we'll ensure that you're rebooked in first class at no additional charge." Elaine set her tablet down, now giving David her full attention. "A discrepancy? We booked these seats weeks ago." "Of course, and we appreciate your loyalty," David said smoothly. "These situations are rare, but they do happen. We regret the error and want to make sure your travel experience remains as comfortable as possible. We've already arranged new accommodations for you on the next available flight." Marcus exchanged a brief glance with his wife before shifting in his seat. "And when exactly does that flight leave?" David tapped on his tablet, pretending to double-check. "In about 5 hours, sir. We understand it's a slight delay, but you'll still be arriving at your destination today." Ava finally pulled out her earbuds, looking between her parents and the airline employee. "Wait, so you're bumping us?" David's expression remained pleasant. "Not exactly. Your current flight is simply at capacity, and the system automatically adjusts reservations when necessary." Marcus let out a small breath through his nose, adjusting his posture. "I'm sorry, but that's not going to work. We have important business at our destination, and we have confirmed first-class tickets for this flight. We're not switching." David gave a slight tilt of his head, his smile never wavering. "I completely understand, sir. However, the system has already processed the adjustment, and your seats have been reassigned." Elaine's voice remained composed, but there was an edge of frustration creeping in. "To someone else?" David hesitated for half a second. "It's not quite that simple, ma'am." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temple before fixing David with a level gaze. "We're keeping our seats. If there's a mistake, fix it." David's smile tightened. "Sir, I'd hate for this to become a bigger issue than it needs to be." Before Marcus could respond, a new presence appeared beside them. A uniformed security officer, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, and standing with his feet firmly planted. His badge read, "Officer Simmons, Airport Security. Is there a problem here?" Simmons asked, though his eyes were already set on Marcus, as if assuming there was. David turned slightly. "Not a problem, just an adjustment with a reservation that needs cooperation." Marcus exhaled, keeping his posture relaxed. "We're just trying to understand why our confirmed booking is suddenly an adjustment." Elaine reached over and placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent signal to keep things smooth. "Sir," Simmons interjected, "we need your cooperation in this matter. We'd like to resolve this without further escalation." Marcus felt a flicker of irritation, but kept it buried. He wasn't going to make a scene over this, not yet anyway. He glanced at Elaine, who gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. "Let's not push it." He finally exhaled and leaned back. "We're not changing flights. If there's a mistake, then someone needs to fix it." David opened his mouth to respond, but another SkyJet employee approached with a tablet in hand. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter, but we've also been alerted to a security concern regarding your checked baggage." Elaine's head snapped toward her. "A what?" David turned to the woman, feigning concern. "What kind of concern?" The woman tapped her screen. "One of Mr. Carter's bags was flagged during screening. Standard procedure requires additional inspection before it can be loaded onto the aircraft." Ava whispered under her breath, "Seriously?" Elaine crossed her arms. "And we're only hearing about this now." The woman's smile was professional, practiced. "We were just notified, ma'am. If Mr. Carter could follow us, we'll resolve this quickly." David took the opportunity to step back slightly. "It's just a routine check, nothing to be alarmed about." Marcus took a slow breath, nodding. "All right, let's get this over with." Elaine stood as well, but David raised a hand. "No need for the whole party to go. Just Mr. Carter is necessary." Marcus hesitated, but after another glance at his wife, he nodded. "Fine." As he followed the SkyJet employee and Officer Simmons toward the security area, Elaine sank back into her chair, shaking her head. Ava leaned in, whispering, "This is getting really weird." Elaine sighed. "It's probably just bad luck." Neither of them realized, in that moment, just how wrong they were. Marcus followed the SkyJet employee and Officer Simmons through the terminal, his expression unreadable. The so-called security check felt unnecessary, but he forced himself to remain patient. Elaine and Ava remained in the lounge, waiting, unaware that this was only the beginning. They stopped near a roped-off area, where another officer stood beside a conveyor belt. A large, black suitcase sat on the table. Marcus recognized it immediately. "This is my bag," he said, glancing at the security team. "What's the issue?" The officer, a younger man with a stiff posture, cleared his throat. "Sir, your bag was flagged during routine screening. We need to conduct a more thorough inspection before it can be cleared for loading." Marcus folded his arms. What exactly was flagged? The officer hesitated. "That information isn't disclosed until the inspection is complete." Marcus felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. This was absurd, but he kept his voice level. "Fine, let's get on with it." Without another word, the officer snapped on a pair of gloves and unzipped the suitcase. The moment the bag was opened, Marcus felt something shift in the atmosphere. The officer began removing his belongings, one by one, with exaggerated slowness. A pair of dress shoes carefully wrapped in dust bags, a neatly folded suit, his toiletry case, unzipped and examined as if it might contain something sinister. People in the terminal started to notice. Travelers waiting in line for security screening stole quick glances. A few murmured to one another, whispering as they watched the scene unfold. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, suppressing a growing sense of irritation. The officer lifted a small container of vitamins from the suitcase, shaking it slightly before setting it down as if it were evidence in a crime scene. Marcus exhaled through his nose. "Is this really necessary?" "Just following protocol, sir," the officer responded flatly, continuing his slow, deliberate search. A few feet away, Richard Wallace observed the entire scene from a distance, his expression carefully neutral. He waited for the perfect moment before stepping forward. "Mr. Carter," Richard's voice rang out smoothly, carrying just the right amount of false warmth. Marcus turned to see the CEO of SkyJet approaching, dressed impeccably as always, his smile polished and insincere. "I couldn't help but notice the inconvenience you're experiencing," Richard continued, shaking his head in mock sympathy. "I assure you this is all just routine, nothing personal." Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "It sure doesn't feel routine." Richard chuckled lightly, as if Marcus had just made a casual joke. "Believe me, I understand how frustrating these things can be, but I'd like to offer a solution." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "A solution?" Richard gestured toward a passing flight attendant, signaling for her to bring over a tablet. "I know your flight situation has been less than ideal, and I hate to see valued passengers inconvenienced like this. Since first class seems to be overbooked, I'd be happy to arrange seats for you and your family in our business class section, at no extra charge, of course." Marcus stared at him. "We already paid for first class." Richard sighed, as if deeply pained by the situation. "I completely understand. But as you can see, the system has placed restrictions on your booking," and he gave a well-timed glance at the ongoing bag inspection. "Security has flagged certain issues that we can't ignore." Marcus's patience was thinning. "There is no issue with my bag." "Well," Richard said with an exaggerated shrug, "until security clears it, I can't guarantee your first-class accommodations. But as I said, I can offer business class as a courtesy." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're not moving." Richard sighed again, shaking his head as if Marcus were being unreasonable. He turned slightly and tapped a few buttons on the tablet, nodding to himself before bringing it up to his ear. Marcus could hear him mutter, just loud enough to be overheard, "Yes, this is Richard Wallace. I need a verification on a first-class booking under Carter, Marcus." "Yes, can you confirm the payment method? I need to ensure this wasn't an error on our end." Marcus's entire body went rigid. He was calling to check his payment? Richard continued, his voice calm but layered with implications. "Yes, I understand. But could you double-check if it was purchased directly through our system or through a third-party service?" He paused, then smiled faintly. "Ah, I see. Thank you." He lowered the tablet and turned back to Marcus, tilting his head in mock concern. "Just needed to verify something," Richard said smoothly. By now, more people were watching. The soft murmurs of passing travelers had grown louder. A woman in line whispered something to her husband, and a businessman waiting at a nearby gate frowned slightly, his gaze flickering between Marcus and the security officers. Marcus inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay composed. He knew exactly what Richard was doing. By calling into question the legitimacy of his ticket out loud, Richard had planted a seed of doubt in everyone around them. Marcus wasn't just a first-class passenger anymore. He was a suspect. The officer searching his bag finally cleared his throat. "Nothing suspicious found," he announced stiffly. Richard's eyebrows lifted in feigned surprise. "Well, that's good news." He turned back to Marcus. "So where were we?" "Oh yes, about your seating." Marcus clenched his jaw. "We're keeping our seats." Richard sighed dramatically, giving the impression that he had tried to be accommodating. He tapped on the tablet one last time before looking back up with a pleasant smile. "Well, in that case, I suppose I'll leave it in the hands of security. If you change your mind, do let me know." With that, Richard turned and walked away, his smirk hidden from view. Marcus stood still for a long moment, the weight of dozens of eyes on him, the doubt lingering in the air. Marcus Carter stood motionless in the terminal, the weight of countless stares pressing against his back. The so-called security check on his luggage had turned up nothing, yet the damage had already been done. Richard Wallace had expertly planted doubt in the minds of onlookers, making Marcus seem like an imposter in a space he had every right to be in. Just as he prepared to head back to Elaine and Ava, two uniformed security officers approached with a quiet but firm presence. One of them, Officer Simmons, the same man who had been hovering earlier, stepped forward. His face was unreadable, but his posture spoke volumes. "Mr. Carter," Simmons said, voice steady, "we need you to come with us for additional verification." Marcus frowned. "Verification for what?" The second officer, a younger man with a rigid stance, responded. "There's been a flag on your payment method. The system has detected unusual activity on the card used to purchase your tickets. We need to confirm your identity before allowing you to board." Marcus took a slow breath, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Are you seriously implying that I used a stolen card?" "This is just standard protocol, sir," Simmons replied smoothly. "We need to verify before we can clear you for boarding." Marcus's fingers flexed at his sides, but his voice remained even. "I already provided my ID at check-in." The younger officer gave a rehearsed nod. "And now we need additional verification. We'll need another form of identification or a secondary payment method to confirm the transaction." Marcus clenched his jaw. This was ridiculous. He had booked these tickets with the same corporate card he used for all his business travel. There was no reason for his payment to be flagged, unless someone had pulled the right strings to make it happen. His gaze flicked toward the VIP lounge, where he spotted Richard Wallace standing near the entrance, speaking with a flight attendant. The CEO hadn't even glanced his way, but Marcus knew. This wasn't about security. This was about control. Elaine, who had been waiting in the lounge with Ava, noticed the tension from across the terminal. She stood swiftly, making her way toward Marcus with her daughter close behind. "What's going on?" she asked, eyes narrowing at the security officers. Simmons turned toward her, his tone unchanged. "We need Mr. Carter to provide additional verification for his ticket purchase before he can be cleared to fly." Elaine's brows furrowed. "That's absurd. We booked these tickets weeks ago, and the transaction went through without issue. Why is this suddenly a problem?" Ava, sensing the shift in energy, squeezed her mother's arm. "Mom," she whispered, "this doesn't feel right." Marcus exhaled slowly, then reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out his wallet. He retrieved his driver's license and handed it to Simmons. "Here's your verification." Simmons barely glanced at it. "I'm afraid we need something more substantial, sir. Do you have another payment method you can use?" Elaine's patience snapped. "So now you want him to pay again for tickets we already bought? Do you realize how absurd this sounds?" Simmons didn't flinch. "If Mr. Carter can provide an alternative payment, we can process it now and resolve the issue quickly." Marcus's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You want me to pay twice?" "This is simply a precaution," Simmons said, his tone cool and controlled. "If everything checks out, the original charge will be refunded." Elaine pulled out her phone. "We're calling our lawyer." She swiped at the screen, but a second later, her brows pulled together. "No service." She muttered, trying again. "Wait, why isn't this working?" Marcus immediately pulled out his own phone, tapping at the screen. The signal bar was full, but his Wi-Fi connection had dropped completely. He attempted to refresh the page, but nothing loaded. Ava pulled out her phone next, her fingers moving swiftly. "Mine's not working either." Elaine's grip on her phone tightened. She turned toward Simmons, eyes blazing. "Did you block our connection?" Simmons remained impassive. "Ma'am, I don't have access to network restrictions." Marcus' stomach coiled with suspicion. This was too precise, too calculated. Richard Wallace. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the man in question. Richard was still near the VIP lounge, casually scrolling through his tablet, his expression unreadable. He wasn't watching them directly, but Marcus knew that this was his doing. Elaine wasn't done. Then, I want to speak to someone higher up. A supervisor, a manager, someone who can explain why my husband, who has provided multiple forms of identification, is being asked to prove who he is again while our connection mysteriously goes dark. Simmons hesitated. Marcus crossed his arms. Yeah, that's a good question. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice slightly more uncertain. Sir, if you could just cooperate, we can resolve this without unnecessary complications. Marcus let out a short laugh, void of humor. Unnecessary complications? You've manufactured this problem. Elaine folded her arms. If this is a security protocol, then show us where it's written. Because last I checked, financial disputes were handled by the airline's billing department, not security. Simmons gave the faintest twitch of his jaw. They were right, but that didn't matter. Because Richard Wallace owned the rules in this space. Ava's voice was small but steady. They're trying to make us miss our flight. Elaine let out a slow breath, looking at her daughter, then her husband. She had no idea how right Ava was. Marcus Carter could feel the shift in the air. The tension wasn't just between him and the security officers anymore. It had spread, infecting the people around them like a virus. He could hear the murmurs, the subtle yet unmistakable change in the way passengers glanced at him. What had started as curiosity had turned into something else entirely. Richard Wallace was standing near the VIP lounge, watching the scene unfold with casual amusement. He made no move to intervene. Not yet. Instead, he walked over to a small group of first-class passengers waiting nearby, exhaling loudly, as if he were exhausted by the situation. Unbelievable, isn't it? He muttered, just loud enough for them to hear. A businessman in his mid-50s raised an eyebrow. What's going on? Richard let out a small, knowing chuckle. Oh, just another misunderstanding. He shook his head. Happens more often than you'd think. People trying to slip into first class with, well, questionable bookings. The businessman frowned. Seriously, Richard sighed, lowering his voice just enough to sound reluctant to say more. We try to give people the benefit of the doubt, but our system catches these things for a reason. It's always tricky, you know. No one ever admits to doing it. A woman nearby scoffed. So they faked their tickets? Richard hesitated, then offered a vague shrug. I can't say for certain, but I can say that our system doesn't flag passengers for no reason. That was all it took. People filled in the blanks on their own. The shift was immediate. The subtle glances turned sharper. The murmurs became whispers. Then, a man near the boarding gate pulled out his phone and started recording. Marcus saw it happen from the corner of his eye. Elaine did too. Her fingers tightened around Ava's arm. Mom, Ava whispered, her voice suddenly small. They're talking about us. Richard finally decided it was time to step forward. His performance had been perfect, so far. Now he just needed to seal it. Is there a problem here? His voice was smooth, carrying just enough concern to make it seem like he was only now noticing the issue. Elaine turned, eyes blazing. Yes, your security team is holding my husband for no reason. Richard feigned a confused frown, glancing at Simmons. That doesn't sound right. What's going on? Simmons hesitated, but Richard had already set the stage. The officer shifted, uncomfortably, before responding. There was a flag on Mr. Carter's payment method, sir. We're verifying. Ah, Richard interrupted, sighing heavily. One of those cases. Marcus clenched his jaw. One of what cases? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the surrounding passengers, letting out another exasperated sigh. This isn't uncommon, unfortunately. We see it more than you'd think. The businessman frowned. See what? Richard smiled slightly, tilting his head in mock sympathy. People booking tickets through, let's say, non-traditional channels. Third-party sites, resellers, even compromised accounts. It's always unfortunate when it happens. Elaine's entire body tensed. Are you seriously implying? I'm not implying anything. Richard cut in smoothly. I'm just saying that when our system flags something, we have to be extra careful. He looked back at the surrounding passengers, shaking his head with performative regret. I do apologize for the delay, folks. We just want to make sure everything is handled fairly. After all, no one should get something they didn't pay for, right? A few chuckles rang out. Someone muttered, figures. Another traveler shook their head, muttering, security should have stopped them sooner. Elaine gritted her teeth. Marcus inhaled sharply, keeping his posture rigid. He had been patient. He had tried to remain calm, but Richard had designed this moment to push him. And then Richard turned to Ava. She had been silent, eyes wide, lips slightly parted. She wasn't fully sure what was happening, but she knew it was bad. Richard smiled down at her, a soft, gentle smile. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he leaned in and said, "You know, kiddo, grown-ups have to learn their place. You'll understand that one day." Ava didn't move. She didn't blink. Elaine snapped, "Get away from my daughter." Her voice cut through the terminal like a whip. Several passengers turned, startled. Richard stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I was just offering some advice," he said smoothly. "No need to overreact." Marcus took a step forward, but Elaine grabbed his wrist in a silent warning. "Not here. Not now." Richard checked his watch, sighing dramatically. "Well, I was hoping to resolve this peacefully, but it seems we're running out of time." He looked at Simmons and gave a slight nod. Simmons turned stiffly. "Mr. Carter, unless you cooperate, we'll have to escort you from the premises." Elaine let out a short laugh. "You mean, kick us out?" Simmons didn't deny it. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. When he opened them again, he locked eyes with Richard, and Richard smirked. Marcus Carter kept his breathing steady, his fingers flexing at his sides as Officer Simmons took another step forward. The murmurs in the terminal had grown into quiet conversation, and every second that passed, more eyes turned toward them. A few phones were raised, recording the spectacle. Marcus could feel Elaine beside him, stiff as stone, Ava clinging to her mother's arm, silent but wide-eyed. He turned back to Simmons, his voice firm but controlled. "I want to speak to a manager. Someone above you. This is beyond ridiculous." Simmons barely reacted. "Sir, I strongly advise you to cooperate before this situation escalates further." Elaine let out a short, humorless laugh. "Escalates? What exactly do you call this?" She gestured at the growing audience, at the officers closing in, at Richard Wallace, standing a few feet away, watching everything unfold with an air of amused detachment. Richard finally decided to step back in, his performance carefully measured. Now, he said smoothly, as if he were the voice of reason, "let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Marcus turned to face him. "I want to speak to someone from corporate. Someone with actual authority." Richard's eyes gleamed. "Oh, absolutely. Let me see what I can do." He pulled out his phone, turning slightly away as he made a show of dialing. He let it ring a few times, then hummed thoughtfully. After a brief pause, he nodded, then spoke into the receiver. "Yes, I have a situation at Terminal B. Name's Carter Marcus." "Yes, I see. Of course. I understand completely." He hung up, sighing dramatically before turning back to Marcus with a carefully crafted expression of regret. "I'm afraid my hands are tied," he said with faux sympathy. "Corporate policy. They said no exceptions." Elaine's breath hitched. "No exceptions for what? We paid for these tickets. You're making up rules as you go along." Richard's smile didn't waver. "I assure you I'd love to help, but my superiors have made it clear." Marcus had heard enough. His voice dropped a fraction lower, enough to make the surrounding officers tense. "Let me get this straight. You, a man who runs this airline, want me to believe that someone else made this decision?" Richard simply spread his hands. "I follow the same rules as everyone else." That was the final straw. Simmons adjusted his stance, giving a barely perceptible nod to the other officers. Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time. Please collect your belongings and exit the terminal. Elaine inhaled sharply. This isn't happening. Richard tilted his head slightly. Well, that's up to you, isn't it? A heavy silence followed. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He had spent a lifetime mastering patience, knowing when to push and when to retreat. But right now, every instinct in his body screamed at him to stand his ground. Then, Ava's fingers tightened around his hand. He looked down at his daughter, her expression a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else. A quiet plea. Elaine swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. We're leaving. Marcus felt the words settle in his chest like lead. Slowly, he nodded. They moved together, Marcus keeping his head high, Elaine gripping Ava's hand tightly as they gathered their things. But the moment they stepped toward the exit, something happened that made Marcus freeze. Not loud, not overwhelming, but enough. Someone actually clapped. It started with one man, a businessman who had been listening to Richard's whispers earlier. He smirked, shaking his head as he clapped his hands together. Slowly, a few others followed, murmuring amongst themselves. A voice muttered, finally. Another chuckled. Took long enough. Elaine's hands curled into fists. Ava's breath hitched. Marcus forced himself to keep moving, even as humiliation burned in his chest. Marcus, Elaine, and Ava walked through the terminal in silence, their steps measured, their expressions unreadable. Security had stopped following them once they reached the main concourse, but the weight of humiliation still clung to them. They had been publicly shamed, treated like criminals, and forced out under the watchful eyes of people who now believed they had done something wrong. But Marcus wasn't thinking about that anymore. He was already focused on the next step. We're not going home, he murmured as they reached an empty row of seats near another airline's counter. Elaine shot him a sharp look, but he continued. We'll book another flight. Different airline. Different route if we have to. Elaine hesitated, then nodded. She was still shaken, but she knew Marcus was right. They weren't going to let Richard Wallace dictate where they could and couldn't go. Ava, still gripping her mother's hand, looked up at them. Are we really going to be able to? She asked quietly. Marcus gave her a reassuring nod, even as something inside him remained tense. Yes, baby, we are. But Richard Wallace had other plans. From his office overlooking the terminal, Richard leaned back in his chair, phone pressed. To his ear, fingers drumming against his desk as he spoke. Yes, I need a flag placed on a particular passenger. Marcus Carter. No, nothing official, just a precautionary measure. I don't want him or his family on any flights today. He paused, listening to the response, then smirked. No blacklist. Just mark their reservation attempts as pending review. Keep it tied up for a few hours. He ended the call, satisfied. He had done this before, enough times to know that even a few hours of bureaucratic delays could wreck a person's plans completely. They'd try to book a flight, their payment would fail, the system would glitch, and by the time they figured out what was happening, it would be too late. Down in the terminal, Marcus approached a counter for Skylink Airways, one of the competing airlines. A young agent greeted him with a polite but tired smile. Good evening, sir. How can I help you? I need 3 tickets on the next flight out, Marcus said, pulling out his card. Destination doesn't matter, as long as it's tonight. The agent nodded, fingers flying over the keyboard. We have a flight to Dallas in 2 hours, and one to New York. He stopped suddenly, frowning at his screen. Elaine tensed. What is it? The agent shook his head slightly. That's odd, your payment isn't going through. Marcus frowned. Try again. The agent did, his brows knitting together as he clicked through the system. It's showing as unable to process transaction. Do you want to try another card? Marcus pulled out a second card. Use this one. The agent ran it, then frowned again. Same message. Elaine inhaled sharply. That's impossible. The agent offered an apologetic look. I can hold the seats while you contact your bank, if you'd like. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He reached for his phone and dialed his bank's customer service. After a few rings, an automated voice answered. "We're sorry, but we are experiencing unusually high call volumes. Your estimated wait time is 45 minutes. Marcus slowly lowered the phone. Elaine's voice was quiet but urgent. "This isn't a coincidence." Ava looked between them, confusion flickering across her face. "What's happening?" Marcus exhaled through his nose, keeping his voice calm. "It's a delay tactic." Elaine swallowed hard. "Richard." Marcus nodded. From his office, Richard leaned back with a smirk, watching the terminal. Below, they could try all they wanted. They weren't going anywhere tonight. And by the time they figured that out, it would be too late. Richard Wallace stood in his office, sipping a glass of scotch, watching the terminal below with satisfaction. Marcus Carter had tried every option, spoken to every airline desk, and yet every attempt to book a new flight had been met with the same technical error. His wife, Elaine, had shifted from frustration to quiet disbelief, while their daughter, Ava, sat curled up in a chair, her fingers mindlessly scrolling through her phone. To Richard, they looked exactly as they should, defeated. He leaned back, confident that by the time the Carters realized they had no way out, exhaustion would force them to retreat. His phone vibrated on the desk. It was an alert from airport security. "VIP arrival expected in 10 minutes. Executive staff report to Terminal C for welcoming." Richard frowned. He hadn't scheduled any VIP visits today, and for something to be labeled as executive level, it had to be important. He immediately called his assistant. "Who's the VIP arriving?" he asked. After a brief pause, the assistant stammered, I'm not sure, sir." The directive came from the airport board. High-level personnel only. Richard's grip on his glass tightened. The airport board rarely issued orders without consulting him. Down. Below, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted. Employees straightened their postures, security officers adjusted their positions, and a group of high-ranking executives hurried toward Terminal C. The normally steady flow of operations became more precise, more deliberate, as if the entire airport was preparing for someone who truly mattered. Richard set his drink down, his unease growing. Something was wrong. Then, the black limousine appeared. It glided through the private access lane, sleek and imposing, before coming to a slow stop at the terminal entrance. The moment the door opened, Richard felt his stomach drop. Marcus Carter stepped out, adjusting his blazer with the same composed confidence he had carried since the moment Richard first laid eyes on him. Elaine followed, her expression unreadable, her movements graceful and controlled. Ava climbed out last, tucking her phone into her pocket, scanning the crowd with a quiet awareness far beyond her years. Richard's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. He had spent the last hour ensuring the Carters had no power, no control, no way forward. Yet now the very people he had humiliated were stepping out of a limousine usually reserved for billionaires, foreign dignitaries, or his mind-raced owners. The executive director of the airport, a man who rarely acknowledged Richard's presence, rushed forward to shake Marcus's hand. Following him, the airport president did the same. Employees who had been present during the Carters' removal now exchanged glances, their confusion evident as they watched the highest-ranking figures in the airport greet the same man they had just seen escorted out. Richard felt a cold sweat break across his skin. His feet moved before his brain fully processed the thought, carrying him out of his office and toward Terminal C. He needed to hear what was being said, to find out why this was happening. As he neared the VIP section, a security officer smoothly stepped into his path, positioning himself between Richard and the Carters. "VIP access only," the officer said, his tone firm but professional. Richard clenched his jaw but forced himself to step back, scanning the scene from a short distance. Marcus was speaking with the airport president, who gestured toward the terminal as if giving him a formal update. Richard strained to hear, but caught only fragments of the conversation. His mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe Marcus had a connection he hadn't been aware of. Maybe he had called in a favor. Maybe. Marcus turned slightly and met Richard's eyes. For the first time that day, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Dread. Marcus didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't need to. His expression remained calm, but there was something behind his eyes, something Richard hadn't noticed before. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was certainty. The truth settled over Richard like a weight he couldn't shake. He had miscalculated. He had played a game he thought he had already won, without realizing he had never been in control to begin with. The Carters had never been powerless. Marcus had never been just another passenger. And now Richard was beginning to understand that whatever was coming next was beyond his control. A slow, knowing smile spread across Marcus's face. Richard felt the world tilt beneath him. Richard Wallace felt his stomach twist into knots as he stood frozen near Terminal C, watching Marcus Carter exchange firm handshakes with the most powerful executives in the airport. He could see the respectful nods, the subtle gestures of deference. These weren't just polite courtesies. This was the kind of treatment reserved for owners. It couldn't be true. Richard's mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Marcus had to be some well-connected businessman, maybe a high-profile investor who had a friend on the board. That was the only logical answer. There was no way, this man could be more than that. Then, the airport president turned toward the assembled staff and spoke with crisp authority. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to formally welcome Dr. Marcus Carter, principal shareholder and majority owner of this facility. The words hit Richard like a freight train. His breath caught, his pulse hammered against his temples, and for a brief moment, he was certain he had misheard. But as the murmurs spread through the crowd, the reality crashed down on him. Marcus Carter owned the airport. Richard's throat went dry as he watched the faces around him shift from curiosity to shock, then to something far worse, recognition. Employees who had witnessed the Carters being removed from the terminal suddenly realized exactly who they had mistreated. A few swallowed hard. Some looked away. Others stiffened, their posture rigid with unspoken horror. Marcus turned, his eyes finally settling on Richard. The CEO felt the weight of that stare pinning him in place. Marcus wasn't smiling anymore. The patience, the restraint, the game was over. Richard forced himself to step forward, clearing his throat, trying to regain control of the situation before it spiraled further. Dr. Carter, he started, attempting a polite, measured tone. I had no idea. Marcus lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His expression was unreadable. The airport president spoke again before Richard could recover. We need to address an urgent matter. I've just been informed that there was a serious incident earlier involving Dr. Carter and his family. He turned to one of the executives. Have you reviewed the footage? One of the senior security officials stepped forward, holding a tablet. Yes, sir. We've pulled surveillance from multiple angles. Richard felt his stomach drop. The airport president nodded. Then let's take a look. Someone tapped a few buttons on the tablet. A second later, a large screen, mounted on the terminal wall, flickered to life. Richard's own voice filled the air. You need to follow me. The footage showed Marcus and his family standing at the boarding gate while Richard's employees deliberately delayed them. Then, another angle captured Marcus being pulled aside for a random security check. The next clip showed Richard himself standing a few feet away, whispering to a group of passengers, subtly planting doubts about the Carters' legitimacy. You'd be surprised how often we see situations like this. More footage played. Marcus being forced to provide extra identification, security officers hovering, Elaine gripping Ava's hand tightly as murmurs spread through the terminal. Then, the final moment, captured from a clear, damning angle. Richard Wallace, bending down toward Ava, speaking in a voice just loud enough for her to hear. Grown-ups need to learn their place. You'll understand that one day. Ava's small, stricken face filled the screen. Silence gripped the terminal. Then came the whispers. Passengers who had been in the background of the footage, some of whom had laughed, some who had filmed Marcus's humiliation, now exchanged horrified glances. Employees who had stood idly by now looked visibly uncomfortable. Richard's skin went ice cold. He took a step forward, his voice thin, desperate. This is being taken out of context. The security officer holding the tablet spoke firmly. Sir, this footage is unedited and includes full audio. it speaks for itself. The airport president crossed his arms. "Mr. Wallace, is there anything you'd like to say for yourself before we take the necessary action?" Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind was screaming at him to fix this, to find some way to explain, to deflect, to win. But there was nothing left to say. He had built his entire career on power, on control, on ensuring that he was always the one with the upper hand. But now, in front of hundreds of onlookers, his downfall was playing out for all to see. And the man he had tried to destroy was the one holding all the cards. Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto Richard's. The game was over. Richard Wallace stood paralyzed in the middle of Terminal C, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing. The footage of his cruelty played on the massive airport screens for all to see, each passing second sealing his fate further. The silence in the terminal was deafening. The murmurs that had once been against Marcus Carter had now shifted, and every set of eyes bore down on Richard with judgment, disgust, and growing outrage. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. With shaking hands, he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. The caller ID sent ice through his veins. SkyJet Board of Directors. He hesitated, knowing exactly what was coming. The weight of the past hour crashed down on him, his arrogance, his unchecked abuse of power, the way he had reveled in his control over others. Taking a deep breath, he answered, "This is Richard." The voice on the other end was cold. "Richard Wallace, effective immediately. You are terminated from your position as CEO of SkyJet Airlines." His breath caught in his throat. "Wait, we've reviewed the footage. This isn't just a PR nightmare. It's a legal liability. You are to vacate your office immediately. Your credentials have been revoked. Security will escort you out. Do not make this harder than it already is." The line went dead. Richard slowly lowered the phone, his fingers numb. Then, as if fate wanted to grind salt into his wound, another sound filled the terminal. A notification chime. Then another, and another. The giant airport screens, still displaying his mistreatment of Marcus and his family, now had something new, a live counter of shares, likes, and comments. The video had gone viral. The numbers climbed by the second, skyrocketing into the hundreds of thousands, then millions. His name, once feared and respected in the industry, was now a worldwide disgrace. Passengers were no longer whispering. Some were openly recording him, some shaking their heads in disgust, others outright laughing. Employees who had once obeyed him without question now looked at him with something he had never seen before, pity. Then came the final blow. Marcus Carter stepped forward, standing before Richard with an air of unshakable authority. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't need to. He simply looked Richard in the eye and said 6 words that would haunt him forever. "You never had the real power." Security stepped in. "Mr. Wallace, one of the officers said, 'You need to come with us.'" Richard's feet refused to move. This couldn't be happening. He had spent years cultivating his reputation, bending people to his will, ensuring he was always the one in control. And now here he was, powerless, disgraced, completely ruined. The officers took him by the arms and began leading him away. The final humiliation came as he was marched through the terminal, past hundreds of onlookers, past screens replaying his downfall, past employees who no longer avoided his gaze but stared straight at him, unmoved by his fate. And then, just as he reached the exit, he heard something that shattered what little pride he had left. Justice had been served. The tyrant had fallen, and the world was watching. The end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. Do you think Richard Wallace got what he deserved? Let us know.